Hello, and welcome to our second lesson on Early Latin phonology. My name is Giuseppe Pezzini, and I teach and research on Early Latin language literature at the University of St Andrews, Scotland. Today, I will talk about syllables, prosody, and accentuation of the Early Latin language. The first slide I put there is pasted from the previous class and repeats 2 points that I have already stressed several times. I will not go through them again, but let me emphasize that they are also valid for the kind of topics I will be presenting today. I think we are ready to start, and I will begin to talk about syllabification of Early Latin, which is at the foundation of its prosody, the rules of accentuation, and also its metrical system, which, however, I'll not be able to present to you today. As regards syllables, the main distinctions in Early Latin are that between open and closed syllables, and that between light and heavy syllables. An open syllable is a syllable ending in vowel, that is, any syllable whose vocalic nucleus is followed by no sound, like rosa, or is found by another vowel, like meus, or is followed by consonant followed by a vowel, like facis, or is followed by a consonantal cluster known as muta cum liquida, that is a plosive plus L or R, like duplex, for instance. A closed syllable is a syllable ending in consonant, that is, any syllable whose vocalic nucleus is followed by one consonant and a sort of syntactic break, but at least 2 consonants other than the muta cum liquida sequence. So, for instance, if I have the sequence dictus, this is divided into dic plus tus. There's a slight exception or apparent exception if the 2 syllables belong to 2 different prosodic domains. At this point, the muta cum liquida rule does not apply. So, for instance, in the form ob reptare, with the prefix ob, this is not divided o reptare, but it's divided ob reptare. In contrast, in a word like probro, we have pro followed by pro. This distinction reflects some basic constants of syllabification of Latin and indeed many other languages. And these are, first, a syllable consists minimally of 1 vowel of diphthong. Second, an intervocalic consonant always occupies the onset of the second syllable. Third, a word initial onset can have up to 3 consonants, but in order to have the sequence consonant-consonant, so 3 consonants in the onset, we need to have the sequence S plus voiles plosive at the beginning. That is, in Latin we find a noun like strabo with st at the beginning, but we don't find words like sr plus consonant or words in the beginning with sf plus consonant. 4 point. Intersyllabic consonantal clusters are divided into 2 syllables, except in the muta cum liqua sequence, which I was talking about. They also have to respect sonority sequences. For instance, in Latin we do find a form like spopondi, so where sonority sequences is not respected in the first syllable, spo, but in the second mid-word internal syllable it is respected, and we don't find spospondi, but we find spopondi. 5th point. In the coda, we can have up to 3 consonants, but we can have 3 consonants only with the final 2 consonants consist in a voiceless plosive plus S. So, for instance, in the word urbs, which is normally spelled with a B, in fact we know that the Latin will have pronounced it with a P, urbs, that is, with a sequence voiceless plosive plus end in the coda. A final important point on the coda: violation of sonority sequences is normally tolerated, and in Early Latin, for instance, we find the word lux. The other main distinction in Early Latin is between a light syllable and a heavy syllable. A light syllable is an open syllable ending with a short vowel, like facis. A heavy syllable is an open syllable ending with a long vowel, for example, feci, or any closed syllable, whether the vowel is short, like factus, or whether the vowel is long, like ductus. Therefore, we may say that Latin also admits what are sometimes called super heavy syllables, these syllables with a long nucleus and a consonant in the coda, such as causa, for instance, or laudans. At the same time, there is already in early Latin a tendency to shorten the vowel length in this kind of super heavy syllables. So for instance, in the early period, we also find a first instance of the form causa with only one S, and also in early Latin it is standard to have the perfect of aureo as ausi, not ausi with double S, which is what we would expect, as for instance in gero, gessi. Syllabification in early Latin is normally affected by sandhi at both morpheme and word boundaries, especially metrical text, but not only metrical text. This often affects the quantity of a vowel and the weight of a syllable. First, a word final syllable in early Latin is normally treated as if it were part of a single prosodic unity with the following word for syllabification purposes. So for instance, et aulud is syllabified e ta liud, and therefore the opening e of et is scanned as a light syllable. In contrast, in the sequence et dicas, where et is followed by a word beginning with consonant, the et is scanned as a close, heavy syllable. Moreover, second point, the vowel of an open syllable which is followed by another vowel is normally shortened. This is a phenomenon known as vocalis ante vocalem corripitur. So for instance, de amo, which we know was originally long, de amo, in fact in early Latin is normally scanned as short, de amo. Final phenomenon, there are some cases in which the two vowels are merged together into a single syllables, and we call this synizesis. So for instance in Plautus we find quite often the form deorum with eo as a single syllable. Something similar to synizesis may occur at word end. A word final syllable ending in vowel or vowel plus m, which was a very silent sound in early Latin. This kind of sequence preceding another vowel is prosodically silent, probably not completely silent from a phonological point of view, but certainly from a prosodical point of view. That is, this counts as a single syllabic unit together with the following syllable, and we call this elision. In some cases, these kinds of vowel merging are blocked. The two vowels are counted as two separate syllables. In this case, one may talk of diaeresis, in the case of diphthongs, and hiatus, when elision does not occur and the first long vowel of the sequence is often shortened. So for instance, in the example from the Casina, we have hiatus in the sequence to amas, and we also have a kind of advanced form of hiatus, which, as I said, involves a shortening of the previous vowel, and the original long u of tu becomes short tu. I can now talk about early Latin accentuation. The nature of the Latin accent, its position, and its phonological implications change with time. In the pre-literary period, before the 3rd century BC, it is possible that the accent was intensive in nature and that it was always placed on the first syllable of the word. The main evidence for this assumption is given by comparison with the standard process of weakening of word internal short vowels. In early Latin, a short vowel that during word formation becomes atonic from tonic, that is, that loses the accent, undergoes a process of weakening. For instance, the present stem cano, accented cano, on the a, open on the beginning a, becomes kino if it becomes a word internal atonic syllable, as happens in the perfect stem, kekini, and in compounds, like konkino, which is formed by kon plus kano. This weakening is attested also in polysyllabic forms, such as conficio, which comes from kon plus facio, in which the short vowel is tonic also when it appears in the weakened form conficio. You see that in the first form we have facio, the syllable is accented facio. In the compound it becomes conficio. In both cases it is accented. How do we explain this kind of weakening if in both cases the word is tonic? This has led scholar to postulate that the original accent was not conficio, as per the standard rules of Latin accentuation, but was originally on the first syllable, like conficio. Whatever was the case in pre-literary Latin, by the early period, the accent was no longer protosyllabic, no longer by default on the first syllable, but this position depended on the quantity of the penultimate syllable. If the penultimate syllable is heavy, the accent falls on it, like confectus, confeci. If the penultimate syllable is light, the accent falls on the previous one, if any, like conficia. These syllables are always accented on a penultimate syllable, except in the case of words resulting from syncope of an original final syllable. So for instance, the form istuk is not read ist, but istuk, because it derives from an original istuke. Monosyllables are in early Latin at times accented, but more often are atonic and clitic. That is, they lean on the previous or following word. In some cases, this prosodic dependence is reflected in the spelling. The monosyllable is univerbated to the adjacent word, as in the case of the clitics que or ne, and also originally in the case of prefixes. In some cases, clitics could undergo phonological reduction, as in the case of the univerbated forms of est and s, the contracted forms factums from factum est, as you can see here. In other cases, the clitic nature is not displayed in the spelling, but can be inferred by metrical or phonological considerations. For instance, we are quite sure the monosyllabic forms of esse, even when not univerbated and reduced, did not normally carry an accent. Another peculiar feature of clitics in Latin is that they can result in an accent shift. For instance, the form rosa on its own is accented, as we would expect, as rosa, but if it gets the addition of a clitic que, it's no longer accented rosaque, as we would expect according to the standard rules of Latin accentuation, but instead it is accented as rosaque. There were also some disyllabic clitics and words that formed a prosodic unity with an adjacent word, especially in the case of syntactic units, like for instance supra lacum, found in Plautus, which we know by metrical considerations was considered as a prosodic unity, with supra, the syllable, considered as a clitic. As regards nature, most scholars believe that by the early period the Latin accent was no longer intensive, it was melodic. However, this is not undisputed, and there are some scholars, and I will say like myself, who think in a different way. In whatever case, in early Latin, the accent continued to have some influence on the phonology and the quantity of syllables. As in the previous stages of the history of Latin, atonic syllables continue to be exposed to weakening or loss, syncope, both word internally and word finally. However, this kind of phonological reduction were not all completed in the early period, and in many cases we find in the early Latin sources optional variants for the same form. As regards the former type, word internal syllable, in Plautus, for instance, we find both the old form sinistra and dextra and the reduced forms sinistra and dextra, with syncope of the word internal atonic syllable. As regards final syllables, we find in early Latin the general shortening of atonic vowels in final syllables. So for instance, the form possit is found long in Plautus, but can also be found short in other authors. We also find the complete loss, in some cases, of final short vowels, such as in particular the loss of final e, short e. For instance, in early Latin we do find the old form face and duce, with final short e, but also the modern developments fac and duct. Both forms are attested in Plautus, and it's not impossible that they were used with different stylization. Accentual factors are also present in one of the most intriguing and mysterious, if you want, phenomena of early Latin prosody, known as iambic shortening. Iambic shortening is the treatment of as two light syllables, as a pyrrhic sequence, of a prosodic sequence that should be normally treated as an iambic sequence. So you see a sequence which is supposed to be originally light and heavy, is indeed treated by iambic shortening as light and light. This sequence can be iambic either originally, lexically, like cave, This is the form of the imperative of caveo with an original long vowel, but in many earlier Latin texts, this form is normally found as cave, as two shorts. In other cases, the iambic sequence can be iambic by Sandhi phenomenon. So, for instance, the sequence apud me. Apud is originally a pyrrhic, light, but if it's put before a word and beginning in consonant, it becomes iambic technically, but in fact, it's normally scanned as a light syllable, as a pyrrhic sequence. In some cases, we also find iambic shortening within polysyllables, like in the case of the form voluptati, but my colleague Wolfgang de Melo will talk more about this. In some cases, we also find iambic shortening when the phenomenon is spread over two words. For example, I give you one example, which is, for instance, from Plotus, TBS. We have the sequence TBS, which is iambic by Sandhi rules. It's a prosodic unit with one monosyllable reduced. This sequence should be considered as iambic, but in fact, it is normally scanned as short and short. Iambic shortening is attested in all early Latin dramatic verse, both comic and tragic, and is also found as late as Dulcalius' Iambato Caix at the end of the 2nd century BC. It's quite likely that the phenomenon had its origin in speech and is probably related to the phrasal stress patterns. The only real restriction for iambic shortening is that the shortened syllable cannot be tonic, cannot carry the accent. Nevertheless, some scholars believe, and I will agree with them, that its extended use in poetry should be regarded as a form of metrical license, rather than the reflection of a phonetic phenomenon of speech, especially when the syllable affected is a long one. The prosody of early Latin is a very complex topic, which is very difficult to cover in a single class, but I hope my introduction has been interesting enough for you to deepen the knowledge of these topics on your own. Many thanks for listening, or as we say in early Latin, gratias vobis ago. I will see you in the next class where we move on to morphology.